Okay, YouTube, so the Department of Homeland Security warned about terrorist attack against 3 specific groups: the LGBTQ, Jewish Americans, and the immigrants. What's really crazy is they left out Black people. When these sorts of things happen, politically aware Black people become really frustrated. There's a willingness to help other groups, but then there's this cold apathy directed at Black citizens. My followers have heard me talk in plenty of my videos about benign neglect. So we're going to get into the specifics of what benign neglect is. First, we need to break down the words. So the first word is benign. The definition for benign is something of a mild type of character that does not threaten health or life, according to Merriam-Webster. The second definition is having no significant effect or harmless. The next word in the phrase is neglect. Neglect is defined as to give little attention or respect to disregard something. The second definition is to leave undone or unattended to, especially through carelessness. Benign neglect is a phrase that was coined by Daniel Patrick Moynihan in a letter to President Nixon. Nixon wanted to understand what had led to the long hot summer of 1967, which was the tumultuous riots that erupted all around the country. And in this letter, he says, the time may have come when the issue of race could benefit from a period of benign neglect. The subject has been too much talked about. The forum has been too much taken over to hysterics, paranoids, and boodlers on all sides. Greater attention to Indians, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans would be useful. In the past, the Black community has always been aware of the fact that it seems like when we're encountering specific issues that the government can somewhat be apathetic, but when other people encounter the same issues, sometimes to a lesser degree, then the government and the society is alarmed and willing to respond. So then this, of course, brings into attention certain things. For example, if you remember in Dave Chappelle's stand-up, he had mentioned about how much progress the LGBTQ community had made in such a short amount of time relative to the Black progress. When these type of statements are made, typically it's against the backdrop of recognizing that there has been a constant neglect at addressing Black people with the exact same concerns. So in this kind of situation, we're not upset that Asian people or LGBTQ people or Indians or Puerto Ricans in this class have actually been able to be successful. What we're upset at is that their success comes sometimes as a result of government intervention or government assistance, and that same assistance is denied to Black people or given to Black people in worse ways. The statement about benign neglect is best analyzed if you juxtapose it against Moynihan's previous writing, something that was more famous that he wrote, which was called the Moynihan Report. That was made in 1965. Moynihan was an appointee at the U.S. Department of Labor. Lyndon B. Johnson was embarking on his war on poverty. Moynihan's job was to research poverty. While he was studying poverty, he noticed that the poverty that was affecting Black people was different than the poverty that was affecting white people, and went on to say that the poverty for each of these distinct racial groups has different causes and different solutions. Trying to address white poverty would not address the concerns of Black poverty, neither would Black poverty address the concerns of immigrant poverty, and so on and so forth. So then for this reason, I think a lot of people can recognize that those of us who are aware of these studies and this research, we can see that simply creating policies that affect everyone won't solve the problem. And as Democrats have continued to try to do this at times, we've seen that Black success has not been achieved because they've never directed their efforts specifically at Black people. Upon reading through the Moynihan Report, you get to understand why benign neglect is such an absurd statement. In Moynihan's report, he said, 3 centuries of injustice have brought about deep-seated structural distortions in the life of the Negro American. At this point, the present tangle of pathology is capable of perpetuating itself without assistance from the white world. In other words, neglect will lead to perpetuation, which means neglect isn't benign. Neglect is actually going to make the problem continue to exist. When you create the conditions for a group of people to flounder and then inculcate the entire society to hate those people, then you've exposed that group to a great danger. They're going to continue to flounder. It's going to perpetuate and even get worse. He understood that without the intervention of the government, that this problem would continue. And we see this all the time. So then it doesn't make sense to then later on say, let's just go ahead and ignore them. We've made enough progress. It'll figure itself out. What changed from the time when he wrote the Moynihan Report to the time when he was writing a letter to Lyndon Johnson? It just didn't make any sense. So this focus on other groups that Moynihan had mentioned, we've seen this happen all the time. We recognize that there's a lot of attention that goes specifically towards Asian Americans. For example, when it came to the Stop Asian Hate movement, We've seen how much attention Congress is immediately willing to pay towards LGBTQ people, towards women progress. But it seems like that sort of attention towards Black people stopped in 1968. So I've spoken about benign neglect and its effects with the Stop Asian Hate movement, and it seemed like people were truly incapable of understanding the point that I was making. I came up with a few analogies to help us get a more clear understanding of what exactly is the issue with that movement. Let's say we know that children are born out of wedlock in Black families at a rate of around 70%. So then if that's the case, and then if we also know that children are born out of wedlock in Asian families at around 11%, if that number increased to 16% and the government suddenly became alarmed and said, wait a minute, we got to do something about this, and they leapt into action. They created special programs aimed at curtailing out of wedlock births for Asian Americans. They created social programs specifically aimed at helping increasing marriage rates for Asian Americans. And they just did all of these things specifically aimed at stopping this. You could imagine that Black people would be like, wait a minute, this has been an issue within the Black community and you've done nothing about it. Yet you're alarmed when this thing is happening at such a low rate for Asians. And while, yes, that's a dramatic increase, to then respond to that thing while ignoring the fact that it has been prevalent and endemic within the Black community feels like almost a normalization. Here's another example. Let's say you accidentally sever the tip of your finger in a cooking accident, and your family completely ignores it and they just go on about their day. They're fully aware of the fact that your finger tip has been cut off and that your finger is bleeding profusely, but they ignore it and pretend like nothing ever happens. Now, let's say you have a little brother who's a year younger than you, and he accidentally gets a paper cut. And your family jumps into action. Oh my Lord, we have to disinfect this thing. We might need to take him to the hospital. Let's get some band-aids. And they immediately start attending to your brother. To do so would be normalization of whatever you just experienced. Because if what your brother experienced was alarming enough that it warrants a reaction, but they chose not to respond to what you were going through, then that is indicative of the fact that they don't think what you were experiencing warrants a reaction. Any person, you could expect them to feel dejected in such a case. If they continue to neglect your severed finger and ignore that, then because of loss of blood, you could literally die in that situation. You could bleed to death. That neglect would not be benign. It would be particularly harmful. And so then I have to quote this again. 3 centuries of injustice have brought about deep-seated structural distortions in the life of the Negro American. 3 centuries of injustice. This was caused. At this point, the present tangle of pathology is capable of perpetuating itself without assistance from the white world. And so in this case, when you've had these people who have been stratified in such a way, and then you're saying that you're going to ignore them, you know that the problem is going to continue itself. What's even worse, what would make this analogy even more poignant, is if instead of you severing the finger, a guardian severed your finger in that way and then chose to ignore it, knowing that this would be the death of you. That's not benign neglect. It's pernicious neglect. It is deleterious neglect. And so I don't actually like the phrase benign neglect because it pretends as if the government isn't aware, as if economists haven't been able to recognize that Black wealth will reach $0 by 2053. How can people continue to be apathetic with those sorts of numbers, with that type of projection that's really sound? For that reason, the call for reparations, it's not optional. It's necessary to offset the continued discrimination and evil perpetuated by both parties against Black Americans. Let's call it what it is. When we see these things perpetuated within the Democratic Party today, when Biden has control of the White House and the Department of Homeland Security is willing to name these groups while ignoring the threats against Black people, it sends that signal that it's normal. Oftentimes, when Black people are aware that something's happening, we will get gaslit that it's not happening and that it's just anecdotal and that we don't know what we're talking about. Black people for a long time have talked about how it seemed like the government was willing to pay attention to Asians and LGBTQ and immigrant groups, and they're willing to champion their causes but ignore the causes of Black people. For a long time, we were always just told, no, we're making it up, we don't know what we're talking about. This has happened time and time again in the Black community. If you remember, racial profiling wasn't discovered legally until 1997. Now, for a long time, Black people had been complaining about being pulled over by police officers in cases of discrimination for literally no reason. When we were complaining about this for a long time, it was denied. It was denied over and over again until they finally created legislation in 1997 that permitted them to start tracking the data of who was being pulled over and for what reason. Using that data based off of police officers' own admissions, then they were able to discover, wait a minute, you guys are racially profiling. Before that, it was just rumored. Likewise, when it came to police brutality, the Black community had been complaining about police brutality since Martin Luther King's day. Those were some of the signs that were held up during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, an end to police brutality. From then into the early 90s, we were still being gaslit into believing that it wasn't actually occurring. It was in the Rodney King situation where it became crystal clear. It got the nation's attention that this thing is actually occurring, because at this point, you couldn't deny it. They beat that man so miserably and then all got off, which is what led to the crazy riots in 1992. I've frequently encountered the case that unless we can absolutely prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt, they will deny any sort of harm that's happening to the Black community. That's what made me feel so excited when I finally read the Moynihan report and, his letter to Nixon, because I finally had it crystal clear. This wasn't just some random happenstance. It wasn't just something that maybe I wasn't considering. This was intentional. This was actual policy. Let's ignore Black people and focus on other groups. It's still continuing to this day. That's why Stop Asian Hate was wrong. It normalizes the hate against Black people. When Black people are the largest recipients of harm, to look at the people who are the least recipients of harm and to focus on them, that is neglect. It's no longer benign neglect. It is pernicious, deleterious neglect. That does it for this video. I hope you guys can understand where I'm coming from. As always, I'll be reading my comments, and if you have some commentary that you would like to share with me, I'd be more than happy to read it, and I will see you guys then.